Hello, my name is David Brownlee. I'm a retired professor of architectural history at the University of Pennsylvania and a member of the Beth Shalom Preservation Foundation, which is a nonprofit, non-sectarian organization that promotes the preservation and the appreciation of one of Frank Lloyd Wright's last great masterpieces, Beth Shalom Synagogue in Elkins Park. Please visit our website and arrange to visit this extraordinary building. But today we shift to consider an architect who was Wright's close contemporary, who built some of his first great buildings in Elkins Park. That architect is Horace Trumbauer, the other great architect of Elkins Park. Horace Trumbauer is probably the least known famous architect of America's Gilded Age. And his relative invisibility may well be explained, at least in part, by the tone of this remarkable article, printed on the front page of Architectural Record, the most important architecture magazine in the United States, in 1904, when Trumbauer was just 35 years old. It was great recognition, but the article ends up by praising his work rather mildly as the standard, metropolitan, and authoritative thing. And what else is said about him in the article also sounds like very faint praise, which helps to understand, I think, why Trumbauer is relatively little known. The reporter writes, if his work lacks the very decided individuality which has hitherto marked the better class of work in Philadelphia, it is at the same time free from all eccentricity. It is never crude. It conforms successfully to the prevalent standards of educated architects. His works exhibits eclectic facility, which is one of the characteristics of the modern American architect. Indeed, perhaps it is this facile response to the current mode, as much at home with the classic as with the Elizabethan or the old colonial, that is responsible for the absence of any very strong personal qualities. That this impersonality, accompanied by the good qualities of sobriety, accuracy, and good taste, should have come out of Philadelphia is not only a matter for astonishment, but for congratulation. What is this all about? What does this mean? Why this celebration of a lack of eccentricity and a celebration of impersonality? Well, for certain, it is about Philadelphia's Frank Furness, the eccentric and highly personal architect whose work we now celebrate as the inventive quintessence of high Victorian stylistic synthesis and visual power. This is his Greco-Gothic French Renaissance multicolored Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, opened in time for the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. And this is the library that he built 20 years later for the University of Pennsylvania in a style that might simply be called red, certainly before anyone can figure out whether it is Romanesque or Gothic or maybe something else. The Architectural Record went on to categorize this bad old Philadelphia architecture as truly wild and erratic, and to say that architecture in Philadelphia resembles the young lady of the rhyme. When it is good, it is very, very good, and when it is bad, it is horrid. 10 months later, the Architectural Record returned to Philadelphia to continue its exploration of the good architecture, focusing now on a group of Trumbauer's young contemporaries, whom the writer, the architect Ralph Adams Cram, now labeled the Philadelphia School. They were Frank Miles Day, Walter Cope and his partner John Stewartson, Edgar Sealer, and Wilson Eyre. The record celebrated their wonderfully varied architectural productivity: Italian Renaissance, an English Gothic, Lombard Romanesque, and Dutch Baroque. These young men evinced the same facile multi-stylism that the architectural record had seen in Trumbauer, and they and Trumbauer were both praised for it. But these young men would go on to be lionized, while Trumbauer was not. They were not like Trumbauer in several important ways, which makes Trumbauer different, but not, I think, less interesting. They were university trained and active in artistic circles. They all taught in the Young Architecture program at Penn. They worked in small offices for adventurous institutional and private clients. They emphasized craftsmanship and authenticity. They used history to inspire aesthetic invention and not as a recipe book. And while they stood miles away from Frank Furness's eccentricities, they did not abjure originality and personality. And that was not the case for Horace Trumbauer. For although he and the Philadelphia school were alike in standing a mile away from Furness's eccentricities, he had not even attended high school. And by the late 1890s, rather than teaching at Penn, he had set up a large office, pictured here in 1908, where he worked impersonally and at an almost industrial scale to serve the nouveau riche. To do this, Trumbauer emulated the practice of the greatest Gilded Age architect, Richard Morris Hunt, whose Breakers in Newport is at the top. And he lined up talented collaborators in France and England and America to design the lavish interiors of his great houses. Pictured here, these designers made a business of salvaging the interiors of 17th and 18th century houses in England and France and supplementing the old materials with new work, faking it, we might say. In the bottom center is the Paris studio of Jules and Paul Carlion, where the walls for Trumbauer's Duke House on Fifth Avenue are being assembled in Paris. Like his fellow young Philadelphians, Trumbauer loved old buildings. But unlike them, if a client really, really liked, say, the Chateau d'Anières, this stunning mid-18th century house on the Seine just west of Paris, if he really liked it, then Trumbauer would build for the client what it is hard to call anything except a replica. This is the Elms, 1899 to 1901, for Edwin Berwyn, his cottage in Newport, Rhode Island. And the sheer wealth of Trumbauer's clients also set him apart from his Philadelphia contemporaries. He worked for the richest men in the city and among the richest in the world. Berwyn, at left, had the contracts to supply coal to the US Navy and the Pennsylvania Railroad, the largest corporation in the world. Edward Stotesbury, in the middle, was a banker with Drexel and Morgan, and the self-made millionaires at the right, Peter Widener and William Elkins, were streetcar monopolists and real estate developers. This was a world in which Trumbauer was well prepared to succeed. Growing up in the northern suburbs of Philadelphia, he left school at 16 to join the office of the brothers George and William Hewitt. George had been Frank Furness's original partner, and their work retained a certain Furnessian cragginess, but the fantastical was kept in check by the practical. In the late 1880s, when Trumbauer worked for them, they were working for the real estate developer Henry Houston, building him a Castler home at top left, along with a railroad station, church, and a resort hotel in Chestnut Hill, the northwestern suburb of the city, for him, they also designed houses to sell. The house designs show high Victorian vigor, the row of houses on the right, yielding a little to the gentler profiles and softer textures of the so-called Queen Anne style that you see in the trio of houses on the left. And this is exactly the juncture at which Trumbauer left them to set up on his own at age 21 in 1890. His first houses, like this for a developer in Beth Ayres, a northern suburb, are rather old-fashioned and Victorian. But he soon teamed up with the fashion-forward developers Wendell and Smith, And in the western suburbs on the main line in 1891 and 1892, he produced these houses. On the left, the delicate, picturesque form of classicism called Queen Anne, and on the right, a very up-to-date rendition of what we now call the shingle style, which had just come into fashion at that time. Amazingly, this work by Trumbauer shows him running neck and neck with Chicago's bright young suburban architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, who was just a year older. This is Wright's shingle-style house for himself at the right, and the fashionable Queen Anne cottage on the left is one of the designs that he made on the side while ostensibly working for Louis Sullivan. There was surely no other time in their careers when these two architects could be placed side by side doing comparable work, because by the turn of the century, Frank Lloyd Wright had gone off to invent a new architectural language called the prairie style for the middle class, which you see on the right, while Trumbauer had turned to creating historical fantasies for rich people. To be sure, for a while, Trumbauer would continue to help developers create picturesque bourgeois suburbs. This is Pelham in Northwest Philadelphia, another project for Wendell and Smith. But he got his big break to do something very different in 1893, when an advertisement for one of his developer projects caught the eye of sugar merchant William Welsh Harrison, who hired him first to improve and then to entirely rebuild his castle in Glenside, Grey Towers. Grey Towers was ostensibly inspired by Alnwick Castle in Northumberland that you see on the left, but in these early large projects of the 1890s, Trumbauer did not allow himself to be too much encumbered by the details of history, the history that he was now cramming from books to make up for his lack of formal schooling. Harrison was rich, but he could not match the economic capacity of the two men who would be Trumbauer's most faithful clients and influential supporters, Peter Widener and William Elkins. Having made their first fortunes in the 1890s, their Philadelphia Traction Company began to acquire Philadelphia's myriad streetcar lines by the 1890s. And by the 1890s, by the 1890s, they had electrified all of those streetcar lines. Along the road, they achieved along those streetcar lines, they developed real estate. Oh, I'm sorry. The map that you see here is a map that looks like the street grid of the city of Philadelphia, but it's not. It's a map of their streetcar lines. The red circle at the middle is at the very center of their real estate empire. It marks the spot on Broad Street, notably the only major street not disrupted by streetcar tracks, where they built their gigantic houses facing each other. But Elkins and Widener would soon follow their streetcar lines into the suburbs. In 1896, they bought out the streetcar company that had developed the amusement park and working class spa called Willow Grove Park, 6 miles north of the city limits, but easily reached for 15 cents on one of the new streetcar lines, whose tracks you see crossing the middle of the aerial photograph on the left. It was here that they first encountered Trumbauer, by then well settled professionally in the northern and western suburbs, who had designed the music pavilion where Sousa played, the populist restaurant called the Casino, and other buildings in a cheerful colonial revival style. The Casino and the music pavilion are circled in red, and the menu of the Casino is in the center. Their Broad Street mansions were by this time being encroached upon by the industrial city. And with the good experience of working with Trumbauer at Willow Grove Park and the impressive example of Harrison's Grey Towers in mind, Elkins and Widener now hired the 28-year-old architect to build them 3 palaces to replace the weekend houses that they had located about halfway between Willow Grove Park and the city, in a place that would soon be called Elkins Park. These new houses, well, there was a house for each of them and a third for Elkin's son George. One was English Palladian, one was Italian Renaissance, and one was Tudor. Indeed, you could have anything you want in Horace's restaurant. The first house for George Elkins is in the style of late English Gothic that we call Tudor, with charming personalizing details and apparently no single historical inspiration. Built for Peter Widener, Linwood Hall, located across the street, was a colossal Palladian design, drawing on the enthusiasm that 18th century British architects had for the work of the Italian Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio. Often said to have been inspired by Prior Park, located in England outside Bath at the top left, I think Linwood Hall is actually a conflation of the unrealized design for Wanstead House, which would have been the biggest Palladian house in England at the lower left, with details taken from Chatsworth at the right. Inside, the house was shaped by Widener's need for a huge gallery in the stem of the T-shaped plan in which to exhibit the greatest art collection in the city of Philadelphia, which he opened to the public for 8 months every year. The other rooms were decorated by Jules Allard of Paris and the American William Baumgarten. For William Elkins' Elstow Manor, back across the road and next to Cheltenham House, the style was Italian Renaissance, and the interiors were again by Allard. The details are, to my eye, well, they're rather coarse. And while it's often said that this design was inspired by Vignola's Villa Farnese and the nearby casino at Caprola, I don't see a strong connection with them. I'm much more convinced by the suggestion that Trumbauer was looking at the stylish Indian Harbor House, the E.C. Benedict House in Greenwich, Connecticut, with its combination of robust detailing and its sheltering porches. The architects of Indian Harbor were Carrere and Hastings, the New York architects who designed the New York Public Library. Around 1900, Trumbauer's rather loose treatment of historical styles rather abruptly stops. Transitional is the work he does for Edward Knight. Like Harrison, a sugar magnate, Philadelphia was a center of the American candy industry. The little townhouse that he designed for him on Locust Street in Center City is a very free medley of neoclassical forms on the outside. And the interiors, for once designed by Trumbauer and his firm, show his usual delightful nonchalance, a rather stern Louis XVI entrance hallway at the bottom, and a lithe Rococo parlor on the upper floors at top. But, when it came time to design Knight's Newport, Rhode Island house, called Clarendon, in 1903, everything had changed, at least on the outside. The prismatic clarity and simplicity of this rather small entry in the Newport mega house sweepstakes is derived with almost breathtaking guilelessness from this 1717 publication of a proposed house by the British Palladian architect Colin Campbell. It comes from a book that we know that was in Trumbauer's library. And just to prove that this was not a fluke, I show you here the Fifth Avenue Town Palace that Trumbauer created for tobacco man James Duke 6 years later. The interiors are a mixture of old and new elements in the style of the later 18th century. I showed you before the paneling being fabricated in the Collier Paris studios, but the exterior is, well, the polite word for it is inspired by this very impressive house of 1773 on the right. The prototype is in Bordeaux, somewhat off the beaten track, and Trumbauer, we know, never left America, and in fact, he rarely traveled to see his own buildings being constructed. But neither he nor anyone on his staff would have had to travel to Bordeaux to see the Chateau Lobotiere. It could be found in this book on Bordeaux architecture from 1907, which we also know was in Trumbauer's library. But neither he nor anyone on his staff would have had time to travel to Bordeaux. I'm sorry. How did Trumbauer produce 800 sophisticated designs before the Depression shut things down. It was a matter of organization, centered on his excellent staff of around 20 people, the key members of which are shown in this rare 1907 photo, the one that we saw before. Notably, Trumbauer isn't in it, so I've added him at the top right, where I'm afraid the little insets are blocking your view of him. Almost everyone on the staff had more formal training than the boss. The chief designer at this date was Frank Seeberger. He was generally credited with the big Elkins and Widener houses of the 1890s, although he would have not designed everything, instead figuring out how to distribute the work and reviewing the progress of the designs. He had studied architectural drafting at the Franklin Institute and studied architecture at the Pennsylvania Museum School. He left Trumbauer in 1908, subsequently forming a partnership with Charles Rabinal, another staffer, who had an architecture degree with a bunch of student prizes from the University of Pennsylvania. William Frank had arrived in the office only shortly before this photo was taken. And he would take evening courses at Drexel while working during the day for Trumbauer, as many young designers did at this time. He was a proficient engineer and a specification writer. And he eventually brought his son Edward, with whom he's seen at an early age in the 1920s. He would bring Edward into the office. Together with Julian Abel, the Franks would continue the so-called Office of Horace Trumbauer after the boss's death. Indeed, Frank's grandson, Christopher Frank, operates a home remodeling business called the Office of Horace Trumbauer in Pittsburgh today. In addition to these long-serving design staff members, Trumbauer hosted briefly a virtual who's who of talented young Philadelphia architects who worked for him for a while before setting out on their own or moving on to another office. Now, naturally, we are drawn in our scan of this staff roster to Julian Abel, Penn Architecture's first African-American graduate, whom Trumbauer hired in 1906. His partnership with Trumbauer was profound, and he would join William Frank to lead the firm after the boss's death in 1938. Abel is a fascinating, magnetically attractive figure. Despite racism, despite the fact that he worked in the anonymity of a large firm, and despite the fact that, to be fair, the Trumbauer firm was not part of the avant-garde, he was well known in his time in the circles of those who, well, like us, are interested in architects and architecture. From the start, Abel made waves as he passed through Penn. As a sophomore, he was already seated in the front row of the Architectural Society, and he was its president in his senior year, 1902. In his day, Penn architecture students worked in this drafting room on the third floor of College Hall. And there, Abel, who already had an architectural design certificate from the Pennsylvania Museum School, immediately demonstrated that he knew how to make impeccable shadow cast renderings, evocative portrayals of old buildings, and vibrant life drawings. Abel won many prizes in the relentless succession of student competitions that defined architectural education in those days. An aristocratic house on the left, a specialized botanical museum on the bottom left here, a post office on the right, and in his final year, his graduation year, a huge cathedral. As a junior, he won 2 competitions to create real things: a tablet for recording alumni gifts to the library at Penn on the left, and a memorial gateway on the Haverford College campus honoring a tragically short-lived student athlete. Abel graduated in 1902 with more awards than any classmate, and Penn's yearbook, of which he was an editor and in which he was listed first because of the spelling of his name, called him Willing and Able. After graduation, he enrolled in a further design course at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, probably while continuing to work in an architect's office, as he had done while studying at Penn. However, starting in the spring of 1903, and for the next 3 years, Philadelphia's T-Square Club, of which Abel was a member, gave Bonners Ferry, Idaho, as his address. He had moved there to be with his beloved elder sister, Bess, whose husband, John Cook, was the postmaster and a pharmacist in that tiny town in Idaho. And he helped his sister extricate herself from what had turned out to be an unhappy marriage and moved her to Spokane, Washington, 90 miles away, where he designed a house for her, which still stands, although its stucco was recently covered with siding. Thanks to Zillow, I can show you the welcoming arts and crafts interiors. In 1906, Abel brought Bess and her children back to Philadelphia, and she lived with him for the rest of her life. Until the scholar Drek Wilson figured out that Abel had been in Idaho and in Washington, it was speculated that after Penn, Abel had gone off to Paris to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. This was logical given the great respect that he later showed for French classicism. And it is true that he wanted to go to Paris, and in 1908 he applied for a passport in anticipation of the trip. That's his passport application on the left. But that trip had to be postponed. Only in the spring of 1914 did Abel finally get to Europe, when he made these sketches of a Gothic house in France on the left and of Palladio's great basilica in Vicenza. The building itself is in the center, and his sketch of it is on the right. It appears that he also made these delicious watercolors of buildings in Italy, France, Germany, and Spain on that trip. It's likely that Abel postponed his initial trip because he was very busy. He had gone to work for Trumbauer upon his return to Philadelphia from Washington State in 1906, and he would become the chief designer in the office sometime after Frank Seeberger left in 1909, probably quite soon after Seeberger's departure. What were things like between Abel and Trumbauer? Both were shy and retiring in demeanor, and while the black man with a college degree and the white man who had apprenticed in an architect's office after 8th grade were not close friends, they were said to have treated each other with unfailing personal and professional respect and courtesy. In 1919, they both bought houses, these houses, for themselves, and we know that each visited the other at home, but not often. Abel's house on the left is in Doctors Row on Christian Street, home to many of the city's black professionals in the 1920s. And Trumbauer's is in Winfield, a pleasant place, but it's not the main line. That's Abel and the French musician Marguerite Boule, whom he married in his backyard in 1925. Trumbauer had married earlier a divorcee who was older than him. What can we say specifically about the work that Abel did in Trumbauer's office? I'll give you a couple of glimpses from my own research. First, the Free Library of Philadelphia. On April 10th, 1911, 3 generations of the intermarried Elkins and Widener families, P.A.V. Widener himself, his son George, who had married Elkins' daughter, and the son of that marriage, Harry, met with the library head and convinced him, and then the mayor of Philadelphia, that Trumbauer, their favorite architect, should be appointed to design the new library for Philadelphia that they aimed to subsidize. The job was assigned to Abel, which we know because it was he who presented this design to the clients on October 5th, 1911. And he presented this design to the city's art jury, on which some of the city's leading artists and architects served, on April 2nd, 1912. This library project was interrupted, however. Just 8 days after the presentation to the art jury, the Titanic sailed from England. On board were George Widener, his wife, Eleanor Elkins, and their son, Harry. They had been scouting chef talent for their new Ritz-Carlton hotel, which was designed by Trumbauer, and the 2 men did not make it home. Instantly, the family's library building propensity shifted from Philadelphia to Harvard, Harry Elkins Widener's alma mater, where they hired Trumbauer at left, flanked by the widow Eleanor and her surviving son, George Jr., where they hired Trumbauer to design a memorial library. As demonstrated by Abel's direct correspondence with Harvard Library Director William Coolidge Lane, Abel was the designer of that rapidly built neoclassical monument, and people at Harvard knew that he was. Back in Philadelphia, the city had been slow to come up with its part of the library funding, and Abel got to revise his design, matching more closely the buildings on the Place de la Concorde in Paris that it emulated. He took this revision to the art jury in 1916. And when the construction system was shifted to steel in 1919 and the building shrunk in 1920 to save costs, he engineered that as well. These changes made the library resemble even more closely its Parisian inspiration, certainly putting it more in line with the Trumbauer office's archaeological bent. That's Paris on the right and Philadelphia on the left. Although, as this little history has suggested, Abel's own first instinct was to be much less constrained by history. In any case, not all were pleased by this direction of the design. Paul Cray, the famous architect who headed Penn's architecture program starting soon after Abel graduated, opined in this letter to the art jury, "The Place de la Concorde buildings being a masterwork, there is no doubt that the Philadelphia Library will be successful on the whole. However, it will be a matter of regret to some that such an important building built by the city will not deserve more than the doubtful praise of being a copy of a good example." That sort of complaint was inevitable, given the character of the Trumbauer firm's work. But that character was exactly what attracted others. Eleanor Elkins Widener, widowed by the Titanic sinking, persisted in building Miramar, the house that she had planned with her husband, Trumbauer's design, for a cottage in Newport, which is a design in a cool French neoclassical style, with another interior by André Carleon. Miramar also has formal French gardens designed by a new Trumbauer collaborator, the eminent French landscape architect and city planner Jacques Grébert. These attracted a good deal of notice, and in 1913, Trumbauer invited Grébert to return with him to Linwood Hall, which of course he had designed 15 years earlier, where the Wideners were making additions and alterations. This work was steered by P.A.B. Widener's surviving son, Joseph. Grébert, while Widener enlarged the exhibition space inside, Grébert cut down the old landscaping to create a low-lying geometrical pattern that provided what he called a more respectful framing of the house. The Trumbauer and Grébert team was also selected by the 50-something newlyweds, the widow and widower Eva Roberts and Edward Stotesbury, who married in 1912 and undertook to build their dream house. The couple is at the left, Trumbauer is at the right, and in the middle is Eva's son from her first marriage, Jimmy, with the cap. Stotesbury had vast wealth from banking, railroading, and steel, and he acquired a vast tract of land just northwest of the city on which Grébert could lay out a wonderful bivalent landscape for Trumbauer's imaginatively bivalent house. The entrance route for a carriage or automobile curved its way through a picturesque landscape in the style of an English 18th century garden, a garden like Stourhead, and it led to a porticoed facade like that of an 18th century English Palladian country house. But pass through the house and look out into the gardens on the other side, and one found the formality of a 17th century French garden like Versailles. And looking back on the house from that side, one encountered a facade as chastely rectangular and as French as the Grand Trianon at Versailles. The interiors were the work of Lucien Allouin, who had offices in both Paris and New York. And they are rather chilly, leaning more heavily to the French than the English side, except for some exterior fragments left adrift in what is now a suburban housing development. All of Whitemarsh Hall was demolished in 1980. Now, one important collateral effect of Trumbauer teaming up with Jacques Grébert to create the formal landscapes of Whitemarsh Hall and Linwood Hall, one outcome of that is that the clients, Edward Stotesbury and Joseph Widener, had Grébert in mind when, as members of the Fairmount Park Commission, they faced the challenge of filling in the big, depressing blank space created by demolishing 1,600 buildings to create the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. In 1917, they invited Grébert to propose a solution. And that fall, at the height of World War I, he brought a set of gigantic drawings to Philadelphia, drawings that showed an intricate set of gardens that would line the parkway from the tower of City Hall to the site of the planned art museum on Fairmount. That great image was enough, it seems, to keep people's hope alive as the work of building the parkway proceeded very, very slowly. A key part of the parkway, of course, was the new Philadelphia Museum of Art, which was to join the new library along that roadway. Like the library architect, the museum architects were also named in 1911. And Trumbauer was one of those selected, no doubt thanks to the support of P.A.B. Widener, for whom he built Linwood Hall, and Edward Stotesbury, for whom he had already remodeled another house before designing Whitemarsh Hall. Widener and Stotesbury were members of the Fairmount Park Commission, which was in charge of building the museum as well as the parkway. But this time, Trumbauer was put in a strange partnership with Clarence Zanzinger and his partner Charles Bourree. Trumbauer and Zanzinger were very different. One, Trumbauer, a self-made entrepreneur, and the other, Zanzinger, an Ivy League graduate, Yale and Penn, who had attended the École des Beaux-Arts. They were contemptuous of each other, and it was said refused even to speak. And not surprisingly, upon appointment, the two firms prepared two distinct designs. What appears to be Zanzinger's is at top a rather grave Roman-style building that looks distinctly civic, while the presumptive Trumbauer design at the bottom looks more like a large country house than a museum. Undoubtedly, because of P.A.B. Widener's liking for Trumbauer, it was his and his special influence. Widener had once promised to pay to build the new art museum. Because of that, it was Trumbauer's design, I think, and I think it was the work of Abel, that was published in 1912. But the art jury only tabled it for further discussion. There was no money to build the art museum anyway, and so the two firms continued to work separately, assigning the work to two 1913 Penn grads who had recently come to work for them. Howell Lewis Shea, working for Trumbauer, produced the design on the left, and William Pope Barney with Zanzinger, that one on the right. There's no time to discuss them today, except to note that both were intended to be built in parts, owing to the city's perpetual funding problems. But suffice it to say, the Fairmount Park Commission really wanted only one design. And when money finally became available to get started in 1915, they demanded just one. Good documentation shows that it was Shea in Trumbauer's office who worked out the compromise that was put on display with this model in City Hall courtyard at Christmas time in 1915. Shea and Barney soon went off to do other things, leaving the finalization of the design and its presentation to others. Construction documentation was prepared in Trumbauer's office under Abel's supervision, and Abel created these splendid presentation drawings in 1919. When construction at last began in 1919, Charles Bourree, Zanzinger's partner, comes into the story, convincing his fellow designers and a skeptical client to build the museum of yellow Minnesota dolomite and to decorate it with bold polychromatic terracotta. It's perhaps needless to say that no public mention was made of the junior men in the two offices, and we can assume that similarly complicated and hidden stories lie behind all the vast productivity of Trumbauer's office. Many of the long list of country houses that Trumbauer built for the rich, like Linwood Hall and Whitemarsh Hall and Miramar, are rather cool renditions of French and British 18th century classicism. But the office sometimes adopted the warmer colors and gentler forms of English medieval and Baroque architecture, epitomized by Ardrossan, built just before the First World War, which is the architectural star of the Philadelphia story. Ardrossan was famously a house designed for partying, with a suite of huge entertainment rooms, all fitted out with wood paneling designed by Sir Thomas Allen. This was his first collaboration with Trumbauer. This variety of styles in Trumbauer's office was certainly made possible by the variety of talents that he attracted to his workforce, and by the historical knowledge that was available in books, the books that he collected. But in this case, the inspiration came not from an actual 17th century English house, but from Arden Run Place, a modern English house by the fashionable architect Ernest Newton, which Trumbauer knew about because he subscribed to Country Life magazine, that fashionable journal devoted to the architectural and human beauties of the English countryside. It's another indication of the self-taught Trumbauer's reliance on publications. And it was also evidently, while paging through Country Life, that the great Tudor house of Compton Winyates caught Trumbauer's eye, or perhaps the eye of Eleanor Widener Dixon, whose father and brother went down with the Titanic and whose widowed mother built Miramar. She turned to Trumbauer to build herself an Elkins Park home on the model of Compton Winyates, which you see on the right, which she called Ranelagh, which was her own name, Eleanor, spelled backwards. Well, why not? And the Trumbauer firm wasn't just about houses. They populated the Philadelphia skyline with several kinds of tall classical office buildings, like the enlargement of the Land Title Building, where Trumbauer had his office, and the Widener Building. And a Gothic bank on the left, with the Locust Street Theater in its base, and a big colonial revival block for the Public Ledger newspaper right next to Independence Hall. The office had a substantial sub-specialization in hotels, including the Ritz-Carlton at the center, famously built by George Widener in 1911-1912 after his wife was asked to leave an event at the Bellevue Stratford across the street where she had lit a cigarette. The search for a cook for this new hotel was the cause of that fateful voyage on the Titanic. In the 1920s, the firm built giant convention hotels in Philadelphia and Peoria, and a pencil-thin Gothic residential hotel on Rittenhouse Square. And just before the Depression hit, the Trumbauer office designed two vertical campuses, a skyscraper medical school for Hahnemann, another architect ultimately got the job, and another skyscraper hospital for Jefferson. Hahnemann was rendered in Art Deco Gothic, while Jefferson was Art Deco Romanesque. They call to mind the fact that the Trumbauer office had been the launching pad for Philadelphia's greatest Art Deco skyscraper architect of the 1920s, Howell Lewis Shea, the man who had worked out the compromise design for the Art Museum. This is his boldly massed and vividly decorated Market Street National Bank. Mayan Modern is perhaps the only name for it. The firm's biggest institutional work was for James Buchanan Duke, the man for whom the firm had designed that very formal mansion on Fifth Avenue. For Duke, they designed the two campuses in two styles needed to transform Durham's Trinity College into Duke University. The women were given Jeffersonian classicism, which the Trumbauer firm grafted on to the existing campus buildings, while the all-new men's campus was English medieval. This was not the usual style of Trumbauer's office, and it seems that they drew on Philadelphia's collegiate Gothic expertise. Well represented in their office, the office that Trumbauer and Abel had assembled, where the key man was probably Valentine Lee, a University of Pennsylvania grad who worked for Stewardson and Page, the campus architects at Penn, before joining Trumbauer. He is recorded as making many visits to the Duke campus, while the construction was going on, although the client died when things were just getting started in 1925, the huge project was built fast. It's not clear from the correspondence that Julian Abel ever visited the site, but it is clear from the correspondence that they knew that he was working on it. After the boss died, and Julian Abel took over the firm in partnership with his old friend William Ott Frank. The names of the two younger men do appear on the title blocks of the drawings, as they do in the lower right in the drawings for the building, the gymnasium that is now called the Cameron Indoor Stadium, which was built in time for the 1940 commencement of Duke University, 2 years after Trumbauer died. In the last year of Abel's life, in 1950, he got to see the launch of the last piece of the Gothic West Campus, the Allen Administration Building, where his own portrait now hangs. The Duke campus work is another example of the pluralistic polish that was characteristic of the Trumbauer firm. The firm, a kind of polish and sophistication that makes it so incredibly difficult to figure out what Julian Abel and Trumbauer actually liked. What were their preferences? And what did they do? Trumbauer wrote not a word about what he liked, and Abel was so consistent in preserving the anonymity of big office practice and so graceful in navigating around the vile indignities of Jim Crow America, guided, it seems, by a kind of green book for architects, that it is very difficult for us at this remove to reconstruct the likings and the authorship that he brought to this work. But we learn more about this every day. Based on the designs with which Abel is known to have been most closely connected, the Free Library, the Widener Library, I've long suspected that he created the cool classicism, mostly French, but with a hint of Robert Adam, of this house for Otto Eisenlohr, who was another tobacco man. It was given to Penn by his widow and is now the Penn president's house, and that's Amy Gutman, until recently our ambassador to Germany. And Penn has actually claimed that it was Abel's work for 30 years, but it has to be said that this was without evidence. That's changed recently. 2 years ago, Bill Whitaker, the director of Penn's Architectural Archives, cataloged this blueprint of details for the parlor of the Eisenlohr House, which is dated April 1911. Unlike most drawings that we've seen from the Trumbauer office, this one has a block at the lower right that I've circled in which architects and draftsmen logged in their hours. It shows that between February and May 1911, 3 men worked on this drawing, and that the first was JFA, Julian Francis Abel, who did by far the most as well as the first work, 11 hours on 3 consecutive days in February. Later, on May 27, the last person to look at this drawing was CR, probably the Charles Rabinold over whose shoulder Abel is looking in that group photograph of the Trumbauer staff. He spent only a half an hour with the drawing, probably doing a final check. and 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 we can follow the drawing, this particular drawing, to June 28th, when it was logged in, quite faintly, it must be said, as Eisenlohr drawing number 45 in the office drawing ledger by someone, maybe Rabinol. We really don't know if the person who recorded drawings in this book was chiefly responsible for the drawing, or whether he reviewed and approved it, or if he was merely a recording clerk. In any case, that handwriting in the faint salmon at the top is very unlike, that handwriting is very unlike the bold script with which drawings numbered 55 to 61 were later entered further down on that page in the salmon-colored block on the right. With its distinctive backward tilt, that writing very closely resembles the orthography of the letter on the left. That letter is, in fact, the thank you note that Julian Abel sent to Warren Powers Laird, head of Penn's Architecture School, in 1908, thanking him for the letters of recommendation that Laird had provided for Abel and his friend Louis Magaziner in preparation for their aborted European trip, the one that I mentioned earlier. Again, Bill Whitaker has taken the lead in the research, this time in the, if you will, the forensic analysis of handwriting, which enables us to say that Abel made these entries in the logbook, most of which, notably, were full-scale detail drawings. Adopting his methodology, I compare for you the DE of deer in the letter on the left in blue and the DE of details in the ledger on the right in pink. And here I compare the MA of Magaziner in the letter on the left in blue and the MA of Maine in the ledger on the right in pink. Of course, I won't ask you to believe this without zooming in a bit and lingering over the evidence. Needless to say, I hope, there's still a lot to try to learn about the inner workings of the office of Horace Trumbauer, a lot to learn about the architect who is, I think, the other great designer of Elkins Park. There's a lot to learn, but we're beginning to learn it. Thank you very much. Please visit please visit the Beth Shalom Preservation website and come and visit us in Elkins Park.